everyone, welcome to our episode 5 of All Things Hydrogen webinar series. Today we have Professor James Njuguna joining us from the National Subsea Centre. He is the Integrated Energy Programme lead here at the National Subsea Centre, and today he'll be talking about all things hydrogen storage. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, if you just leave them in the chat, I'll be able to ask James at the end of his presentation and we can get a bit of a Q&A going. So without further ado, over to you, James.
Okay. Thanks, Gemma, for that. Can I just make sure you can hear me all right?
Yep, hear you loud and
thanks.
clear.
Thanks. And I got my full screen, so I can't see you, so I hope I'll still look good on that picture there. So the talk today is about hydrogen storage, and the angle we're taking is how do hydrogen take us to the next thing, which is energy security or large energy capacity in the future. So I'll walk through a little bit of what hydrogen situation looks today and probably where we're going with it, and then probably start looking at different types of storage systems being tried or being in practice for a little while, and also some of the issues that we need to address if hydrogen is to serve us the purpose. So for that, the figure you got on the screen here shows the current situation, well, the situation pre-COVID, which probably more or less echoes the energy demand before the influence of Ukraine-Russia war, and also before the influence of COVID, which probably reflect much more articulate what the demand of energy levels was at that particular time, and which reflects what we probably end up serving going forward in the future. So the global energy, as it looks in our image, is mostly served with traditional biomass. That's wood, tree burning mostly, coal, oil, and gas. Those are the key areas. And if you compare that with the UK model of energy consumption, mostly served by gas and oil, with a few renewable energies coming up on the top there, and obviously nuclear energy. The nationals or different nations have different objectives on how they secure its energy. But the global map, though, is that there's a huge dependency on coal, oil, and gas and biomass to some extent. The biomass demand have not shifted for many years, and we hope that will probably decrease, or you may end up decreasing depending on how renewable energy evolve, and to some extent it may be that the biomass itself will become a part of the renewable energy depending on how we develop it from where we are today. The solution we're looking at from hydrogen perspective is that it's easier to use hydrogen, and there are many advantages we can go with, but there's also probably challenges which we need to look at. The figure we got there mostly highlights some of the advantages. There's high energy density you can store in as a fuel. It's about 33 kilowatts hour compared to diesel and petrol, which is only about 12 or so. So the density of energy storage in per liter or per kilo, sorry, is actually much more higher with hydrogen. It's obviously cleaner. The byproduct is water. Depending on where you start counting the cleanness in terms of green contribution, it's easier to store with caveats, and also simple in a case that we know how to produce it. We have been using hydrogen for many years, and there's a very good established knowledge, know-how on how to work with hydrogen to some extent. It's flexible energy supply, and obviously it serves to the our green agenda in global agreements we have in place, such as Paris one. Today, hydrogen is coming from many different sources. And in the last few webinars, we looked into electrocatalysis process. We looked at energy supply in general, where hydrogen coming from, but more specifically, we look into the electrolysis process with Dr. Carlos Fernandez in the last one. And so here it's just really an overview of what's a global hydrogen supply, and who is supplying it, where's it coming from, and what is likely to be the future given this source of production of hydrogen. So we got methane, we got coal, coal probably dominating a fair good fraction of about 30, just below or shy of 40%. We got renewable electrolysis, where you got pure hydrogen, mostly with the automotive, for instance, vehicles, and if we also have systems would use high pure hydrogen. But the other areas you can produce hydrogen as well through direct conversion from methane or coal directly, or coke as well. The demand is not likely to drop for now. It looks like it's growing incrementally, and this is a figure again pre-COVID, and these have now been accelerated even further with the COVID. But you can see there that it's a linear inclination towards high use intensity of hydrogen, and that's because all our fertilizers use hydrogen. Ammonia is also used for different processing areas. We use it for refining. We use for greener purposes as well, in industrial scale, in food, and so on. So there's a lot of areas where hydrogen was being used even before we got into the current intensity of having an alternative energy supply in the last 3 years or so. So the diversity of that demand is displayed perhaps by this figure here on the left-hand side, where we're seeing that the demand around 2020 is very much dominated by refining and industrial purposes. But since then, that demand will probably grow. Equally, other demands will also come across, mostly around the grid injection and supply systems around that. The transport will also keep on growing, and a likelihood that the power itself, how we produce power, will also probably go further down direct utilization for using hydrogen to produce electricity, which you then use for electrolysis process to then produce hydrogen, and so. But the dominant demands are represented by the pie chart here, where the oil refining, ammonia production, and methane production takes a huge share of the utilization there. So methanol production is hugely interesting because it's another huge source of energy itself, where you use methane within the methanol as a process. But steel production, again, high intensity area where we need different steel for different renewable energy supply. For instance, the wind energy depends on steel as a baseline. Most constructions depends on steel, so the steel production is a high intensity energy supply. So to meet this demand, we will need to produce huge amount of hydrogen scale from where we are today. The upscaling exercise is actually going to go mad in the next few years. And also how we transport it is also another process, because hydrogen in the pipe is also stored hydrogen. So we are not only upscaling the demand and how we produce it, we also have to upscale how we transport it, and equally how we store it. I want to bring this picture into context of why it's also important that we know that that hydrogen, despite its so good and stories we hear, or we creating and curating as the story of good hydrogen as a future energy supply come through, that it has its own issues, and partly because of how we store it, how we use it. And this is 1954 in Bikini Atoll, which was being used as a test site for different bombs by US during the post-Second World War. And the power capacity of the bombs being tried, this hydrogen bomb tried, I think was one of the few series of other hydrogen bombs came through. I think it was the third one to be precise. I think this there was a 15 mega atoms, about 1,000 times much more higher capacity than the one used in Nagasaki, than the atomic bombs used in Nagasaki. So as a security issue, or from a defense perspective, and how we store it, we have to bring this in context that high density concentration of hydrogen in certain areas may itself have a catastrophic effect, which is portrayed by this picture here. And to give the perspective, I mean, the Bikini Islands are still not occupied because not just because of hydrogen bomb, but because other atomic bombs are tested in the same area, so it's radioactive and other issues. But to be precise, the sort of damage down here, you're looking at 100 meters worth of ground being lifted, chunk of 100 meters of ground being lifted in and thrown away miles and miles of space in terms of where debris went to. So the occupation of these reflect that wherever we store hydrogen, we must think clearly about security, but equally about the safety of it, and perhaps also think how we distribute those networks that feed to it and come from it. So I'll start with the large storage just for reflection. Because hydrogen have been stored in gases in small capacity. This is normally in compressed gas, and the hydrogen gases, trucks and cars all use compressed gas in most cases, and that is normally in high purity. You can control the purity, you can control the pressure, you can control the density, you can control other atmospheric areas around the conditions which is required for hydrogen to remain in high purity form as demanded by the fuel cells. But equally, it can be stored in ambient temperature, and that's a good thing, because the way we store it, the tanks we use, whether metal or composites, they have tendency to behave differently when you have stored in different temperatures. So the other one we have is either liquefied or cryogenic. So equally, this is a negative 235 degrees centigrade storage in most cases, and you got transferring back and forth from liquid to cryogenic liquid. And the major issue there is boil-off losses. So just for reflection, you lose about 40% through 30% through that process, compared to the gas process we use about 10% during the transmissions. So it is worth taking into control, and probably remembering that the loss of will probably have a disadvantage and probably negative side of it. However, the liquid nitrogen has been very, very well utilized, and even I mean the Space Shuttle, for instance, have used these programs for liquid hydrogen for many years very successfully. So the other areas which are upcoming, and some of them probably at the gate at this stage, is absorption and adsorption, and also use of hydrides in different cases for storage hydrogen. So you can probably produce hydrogen on demand, and probably reduce the pressure level you got, but then the complexity of the tanks of the storage systems is as diverse as the solid material baseline is for that purpose. And of course, these fuel cells we can either produce on demand. This different type of methods you can use for doing that, for storing in this using the fuel cells. You can produce on demand. You can produce even different hydrogen processes and store it in voltage, and then you be able to utilize that as power for in conversions when you need it. Each of these processes have its own advantages and has its own disadvantages. I'll probably not go into details on each of them. However, in general, the issues that need to be looked into that include the safety, the maintenance. These facilities need to be maintained in almost high, I would say, aerospace medical class level. Durability of the storage systems, the material we use and how we use them will dictate how long we use the storage systems. The refilling, unfilling, the purity, impurity, the reflection of that, and how that impact the long-term storage is going to be an interesting area to watch. The liquid hydrogen need to be insulated, and so the tanks are normally in large capacity, large sizes. But I think the key thing to also remember here is that the safety is how we use hydrogen, but the security is the quantity we keep in one area, and what that means for that area when that huge volume of storage is kept in that space. A big topic in corrosion and monitoring, either on subsurface, onshore, offshore, subsea, whatever you go, as long as you got a pipe, you got a valve, you got a manifold, they need to be maintained. Most of those made by metal. They need to be conditioned to keep them back into purpose. And looking at the large scales, the upscaling side of it, there are many complexities around how we store in that large scale, because the tank size, the storage, the material we use for making those tanks, and how the codes and standard governing how we use those tanks, how we refill them, and that would also play a part in the future discussions. This is just one of the large storage systems in the world, I think, which is used by by NASA at Kennedy Space Center, and it just so to reflect that you can store in large capacity. That's 850,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen, and if memory serves me right, according to my mathematician, it seems that you can be able to serve that almost 700 homes for a whole year without any need for extra energy supply, purely depending on hydrogen. And that's just on one tank. So several of these, then you could probably serve the country quite well. The storage systems in small capacities, mostly used in vehicles, which are probably likely to be scaled up, are very much echoed here. It's the work here by Maury and Horace. Is very probably effective of where we are and where we're likely to do with the technology, which is very much driven by automotive at that time, around 2010. So we got type 1 motor, which is made of steel, and you got type 2, which is made of steel and liner, which is reinforcement in the mid center. And then we got type 3, which is normally made of metal liner and carbon fiber overlap of the metal. And then type 4, which is normally made of plastic liner inside the tank, and then the rest of it is composite, so purely a more composite side of it. The type 5 is trying to reduce the purpose of the liner and have only one composite tank systems, moving towards closer to a pipe configuration. To get all this into place, so you think about the weight, you think how light it is, you think about the strength, and what implication you go for that, for the durability. You think about the size, the small tanks, the large tanks, but as we get the tanks, the storage system complex, we start thinking about what is the composition of how do we store the hydrogen inside those tanks? Is it in gas form? Is it in hydrides? All that come into play, and the bottom line is that we will need to make them light, we need to make them stronger, we need to make them cheaper, a whole lot more cheaper than where they are today. And this is just a summary of that configuration, how it looked. So we got the compressed gas, compressed systems, where you're working with the cores. So the inner core is where you store your hydrogen, and that's reinforced in different layers to strengthen the tanks. So most of the gas is stored around 300 to 750 bars in general, but we may go beyond there as future comes, and those pressure levels are dictated by the demands mostly on the automotive vehicles, where the 750 bar will give you a certain amount of density, reduce the size of the tank, increase the density of hydrogen stored, and therefore reduce the size of the tank. But by doing so, you need much more stronger tank, and so there's a kind of a balance from structural point of view, but also from capacity and cost balance. The cryogenics liquefied hydrogen is transferred back and forth. Here is a game of temperature play. And the tanks normally the core, you got the core area, which has got strengthening members in the core, in the middle area, and then you got different core areas where you got much more supported structure, which is normally where you see these big tanks carrying, which is containing the gas inside. But the inside you got membranes, and you got the access cores, and you got the monitoring systems to ensure that the temperature of hydrogen is in layers and levels that you need on. The general structure, again, just kind of covering a little bit on that, which is a bit of displaying some of the areas where they could develop. I think it's just a picture lifted off the web somewhere. The pipeline systems we have to use, perhaps we have to think about the hydrogen relationship with the materials. And if you're starting with the complex tanks with this formulation, then, and if you're trying to transport large tanks, large amount of hydrogen, the pipes get bigger, they need to be reinforced, they need to be specially coated, they need to think about the pressures level we got, the supply, how much density do we want to be carrying from A to B. And the top image here just highlighting different formulations where we have to think backwards, start thinking about what the tank is made of, how do we reinforce that tank, how do we reduce the material out of it, how do we get the compressor of it, what happens when you drop, when you fall down, when something hits, when you have an accident, if you're in a car, if somebody drop a hammer when working on the tank, on the composite tank, what happened, the future of that. If it's offshore and during an inspection, an ROV end up dropping on it, what do you then replace the tank section? How do you go around that maintenance? So all those issues need to be dealt with in the next few years, hopefully much more sooner, because if we go with that demand capacity, it means that the operation window or incremental window is likely to be the next 2 years or so. So this is more or less the on-demand end of it, where you use material storage systems. This is purely based on absorption, chemoabsorption, and also physiabsorption, and you absorbing the hydrogen in the media and then releasing it when you need it, with using different triggers and supplementing that as on demand as the system, or as you require more hydrogen extraction from the storage system that you have. And the fuel cells, obviously, you can have on demand. You can make hydrogen on demand, but you can probably also make hydrogen to store and only use it when you need it, using various forms of electrolysis methods for making hydrogen. And the next one I'm going to talk about is underground storage. And the underground storage, obviously, is probably quite exciting because it's cheaper, but also to some capacity, if done well, likely to be very successful way of doing it. But my biggest concern, and probably for some people, particularly from an environmental point of view, is that we don't know in the long-term implications for having a storage system of this nature. So to think of that, so we think of hydrogen can naturally appear in the underground rocks, but we're looking at where, for instance, we got a ground archaeological view here, where you look at the where this well, this is probably a depleted oil field, where you got pipes through it. You can pump hydrogen into it. You can remove hydrogen when you want. You can also look in the salt cave-ins. After this one in a Teesside, which is currently being used for storing hydrogen, and you can store a huge quantity of it, because there's almost no size limitation on how much you can store here, as long as you can be able to seal it properly. And the other one here is the depleted aquifers as well. They can be also used for that purpose as well. But either of these have their own advantages, their own complexities, but they are potential storage systems, and the salt cave-ins have been shown to actually work in most cases. There's also abandoned mines, these rock cave-ins as well, and equally, if you can find them in nature, you can also make them. So there'll be probably man-made storage systems equivalent to what you have in this system, through drilling process. You drill and store, almost equivalent to what is done for carbon capture storage. The implication for 20 years, 100 years, we don't know. Hydrogen will leak for sure, regardless of how we seal it, and if what's happened after that length of period, and interrelationship with that hydrogen with the nature is yet to be told story. And this is an image by one of the works in the literature, just demonstrating how the cave-ins system will work. You got the renewable energy, you got the solar, you got the electrolyzer process here. You can produce it, store it, inject, and produce, and then remove when you need it. When you got it, you can then use it for combustion systems, drive the gas turbines, produce energy, electricity, or use it directly from hydrogen gas directly to another energy supply systems. So there is options there, and our option is actually quite a viable option as we stand today. The correlation between those systems is that the depth is important, the sealing is important, the implication around contamination. You got to think about that. We got to think about the availability of these cave-ins, and are we denying ourselves other opportunities in the future? If you store them hydrogen now, what could happen in the future? Could we probably not use them for something else? The cycles of use, how often do we able to recycle, to use the hydrogen using these cave-ins? Can you constantly keep them up throughout the next 10 years, 15 years, the operation window, literally. The pipes which are buried underground can also be used for storage, and equally, we will need to think about how those pipes work in the relationship with the geological roading conditions affiliated with the earth movement in general. So there is a lot to think about. The bit to take here, as well as the depth and pressure, complexity of storage gas underground, is one, it's environmental implication, 2 is the cost, 3 is the capacity you can store there, and 4, you're thinking about the density. So anything you store would have to be compressed in some form to be able to store it in underground. I think that for salt cave-in, I think that it's about 20 megapascals. That's probably one of the figures which is floating around in terms of what you could use as an optimum for compression gases. So there's a lot of businesses in the future for compression industry if hydrogen succeed from where we are today. The relationship around depleted gas reservoir, which is of specific importance for us, particularly in the northern side here in Scotland, you got to think about the hydrogen, natural hydrogen, got by like the other gases which exist in the nature underground. We've got to think about hydrogen, you've got to think what chemicals are in the wells, and all of these have different correlation and implications. You've got to think about the cap rocks, the size of it, the shape of it, and how far can you seal, and what is the implication of that in the long term. If any of these system is disturbed, for instance, if it's an earthquake, what happened with this gas mixture? Would it cause other complexity issues, which definitely would, but what level of complexity is likely to be is the question to answer in the future. There's also water table, and that's probably very critical for us, because if the water table get contaminated, then we probably have huge implications on that. There's vegetation which grows on the top level. If that get contaminated, there's an issue. There's what we call hydrogen sinks. There's only so much hydrogen we can absorb in the air. There's only so much hydrogen the ground, the soil can absorb. Once the balance get lost, then you start having implications of the future source of supply, soil, water, and air. Yeah. So in terms of future prospects, the structural design of whether it's a cave-in, whether it's the storage tank for liquid or for gas, is a structural formation. So we need to think about quite carefully, and have to be a circular system which we can use for not only for next 10 years, for much more longer. We got to think about how that relates to the nature. We got to think about the leakage of other gases into that area, the contamination in and out of that reservoir of gas storage. We got to think about the repurposing at the end of life, which is proving an interesting area in oil and gas itself. We got to think about the pipes we use, and obviously we got to keep an eye on the pound or dollar. With the money, the price being that there is a lot of money to be made, the danger of that is that we're rushing into it to make the money and actually endangering our own life in the future. So that is a balance we need to take very carefully as we consider the future prospects. There's also probably other thoughts, and this is particularly of our interest in the National Subsea Centre, in our geos overall. This correlation between these hydrogen storage systems underwater, where the water factor, the the future factory is likely to appear underwater during the blue economy, as the blue economy evolve. So what we will see then is there's more energy being stored on the ground, and what we're trying to understand is how does that relate or influence the future in terms of marine life, the oxygen, and chemicals around the water, the salt or the freshwater relationship, whether it's subsurface or subsea. But equally, also looking at how do we extractly move it, how does it interact with the vehicles which operate in the waters, and also the energy supply, because to make hydrogen you need electricity. To make electricity you need other sources of supplies, where wind could be a very way to go, tidal energy could be another area to go, wave could become another source, and obviously floating solar is an option to go with it. And then the conversion to that to our cities, the industrialization part of it, the whole integration system is core part of our studies at National Subsea Centre. And the other probably very interesting area is where you look at the complexity of the tanks or storage system itself, where you'd then reduce some of the complexities around the pressure, around the density, and also around the storage tank structural formation. So the construction side of it is the tank itself. You can complex it. You can have different form of, let's say, a factory within a tank, within a storage system. And this is just a good example here by Akorofa, where we look at the storage systems, where you go, the media here being metallic frameworks. You can use porous carbon, you can use zeolites, you can use other combination of chemicals for solid storage. And then you have different formation of different layers representing certain purpose, intended purpose for storage and extraction and refill of this factory or other chemical processing happening in the core area of the tank. Obviously, the metal hydrates are obviously quite popular. They have their own complexity. They need to be functionalized. They need to be put to purpose. They would deplete over time. They may need to be replaced with various chemical formations. We need to think about large scale. We need to think about the governing of these regulations. We need to think about the tanks, formations, in the relationship with the environment that we operate, or we want them to operate, or want the vehicles to be in. We need to think about the geomechanics of the lock systems, if you want to use this system in underground, all that complexity. But the future perhaps will look like these kind of tank systems here on the left-hand side. And the other part, which also is fairly quite interesting, but also challenging, is the LCA, understanding the environmental implications, and equally as well the social implications. The cost is likely to be an issue, but the money to be made likely to have a very good drive on economical drive and technology drive. But the environmental gain within it is not properly quantified. It's actually poorly quantified as in the current state of the art. There's a lot of figures floating around, but those figures are very, they are projections in most cases, and they are not. The baseline does not necessarily go far enough to where material started or where the end of life material end up in. So here we got work being done by some of our researchers. We're looking at the hydrogen LCA. So we're using mostly standard software, using CIMAPRO. We're looking at the we're using the TRACI fashion, which is using ISO standard as a way of reflection of impact assessment. And we've, in this case here, just as for example, you're looking at 1 kilogram of hydrogen production and using this model or proposed storage systems for H2H in sort end. So the early stage results, which we're still examining and probably need to look into, interrogate a lot more beyond where we are, is they are derived using looking at the materials production. How do you get the material used for making that storage system to store that 1 kilogram of hydrogen? You're looking at the transportation of those materials, and also looking at the system use once you go to the tank. And what's becoming quite obvious is that the end stage, which is this stage here, where the hydrogen is going to use, the compression, the compression of the gases, or the storage system, operation of the system that monitor, control, and supply the hydrogen or distribute the hydrogen would probably need to be well looked into in terms of how we can increase the efficiency of those systems. Unless we do that, then obviously the cycle, the energy gains within that within other areas will either be deprived, because the energy losses are hugely very high at the system level. So that's quite an interesting observation, because the hydrogen itself has a huge potential, but the system is going to be utilized to make hydrogen, makes hydrogen not necessarily environmentally beneficial, as per this early study shows here. So that's an area to look at. And I conclude with this slide here, where we're looking at the hydrogen. In the future, there are many challenges, and I'll just mention a few there. There's things like cost, there's things like materials, which relate the complexity of the tanks we use, the safety of them, the efficiency of them, and perhaps the drives where we do them. But there is also social implications as well, which relate to where we put these tanks and what's likely to influence that behavior of people who live in those areas where there's high storage constitutions. If you store in underwater or away from the land, where there's less occupation, it doesn't necessarily mean that those areas are safer either. There are also implications on those we need to look at. The environmental impact need to be properly quantified to be able to gain the gains, and part of that, it means more engineering interventions are required, particularly at the system level, systems configurations and constructions going forward in the future. A few references for those who may be interested, particularly for the cave-ins, because there's a lot of interest in that area as we go. And more thanks to my researchers who have contributed to this work. We've got Gemma Reynolds, who was speaking earlier. We got Francais Amade, who is doing an MSc with us, and Alexander doing a PhD in LCA and policy relationship, and I was working in subsea tank storage with Gemma and a few other colleagues. Okay, that's all for me, and thanks very much for your attention. And this is the next presentation going forward in the future. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James. That was a brilliant presentation. If anybody has any questions, if you'd like to leave them in the chat, then I can direct them to James. Whilst we're waiting for any to come in, I might just ask one myself. On that last slide, you talked about the main challenges and opportunities. In terms of hydrogen embrittlement, that is a big challenge for the industry. Do you know if there's any ways to prevent hydrogen embrittlement, or how the industry is working around it?
The hydrogen embrittlement is a reaction of this chemical reaction of metals, where in most cases we can get rid of that with coatings, which is another area where you can use thin coatings around the pipes, interior part of the pipes. But it's probably also worth thinking, which we haven't done that, but we may need to look at that in the future. How do we make the steel that make the tank itself, so that the embrittlement process can be reduced? And that could be advantageous or disadvantageous. Perhaps what we need to probably think of is, in the long term, we're trying to stop hydrogen embrittling, but maybe could we use hydrogen embrittlement inversely as a way of storing hydrogen in the future, perhaps? So, and that's probably part of the discussions to have. Should we be fighting it, or should we be working with it in terms of solving the solutions around embrittlement? But there are other solutions. We can use hydrogen thermoplastics work quite well. We know, for instance, polyamide 11 and 12. We know some of the HDP grades, ultra high molecular weight, polyolefin families do, some of them, particularly ethylene family, has a huge control of hydrogen permeability. So we could probably be that between amides family and polyethylenes and polyamide group or imide group, following that. There is opportunities to control that. The baseline is going to be price we pay for it, and the cost of those materials. Is the polyethylenes are cheap in general, but the HDP in this capacity, in this size and scale, isn't likely to be an expensive toy, because the way we reinforce it later on, not polyethylene itself, but how we reinforce the tanks and how we control the input and output of the storage systems.
Thank you very much. There is a question in the chat from Nicholas, and it says, thank you, James. Looking at the future and the wider picture as well, we see a lot of Scottish policy support it going to innovation, but is the policy framework fit for purpose for encouraging citizens and communities to understand hydrogen and create a social acceptance and future uptake for hydrogen?
That's a nice. It's a nice question, and my feeling is that the community is not well educated yet what hydrogen means to the society, and I think there need to be much more detailed work to be done in terms of educating the community what do hydrogen mean in terms of their future, but also understanding the implications that it may have having hydrogen as part of their future. So, and some of those are quite simple, some of them are quite complex. You know, this complex in terms of security. We should, you know, if you got blast in an area where hydrogen pipe have leaked, what would mean that for that community who live in that area? Is it likely to influence how they live? Do they stay there? Do they move out? Does it influence the future generations' perception of hydrogen, the public perception of hydrogen, that therefore influence other issues? There's probably also much more intrinsic area to look at is hydrogen green, as we say it is today? So understanding of that is also important. But the policies framework, which I think is in place, is a good effort, but I don't think it goes far enough. But I start to be corrected.
In terms of the policy currently, do we think now's a good time for energy industry players to take advantage of the loose policy that surrounds hydrogen?
Policy side is an interesting. I mean, the UK economy and Scottish economy in particular is driven by having a policy, and then we follow the policy. Technology follow the policy. The hydrogen have been there for many years, but because now we have a clear policy in 2026 going upwards, the houses will be having hydrogen access. The government have committed to it, then there's actually interest and drive to go with it, not just in the UK, but also in many parts of Europe and Asia. But I think the question, part of the questions coming through that process is that, you know, business is business, and so there will be always opportunity to be able to make more resource. You know, the capital comes into play. But if you look where the future sits, the capital, the economy is driving, and energy security is driving where we want to be. But I think we will need to sit back and reflect back on that. We cannot stop technology developing, but we probably need to think, how do we work with that technology to develop policies which keep that, so that we do not create a situation where we actually cannot solve in the future. There are a lot of very good historical examples of that, and I think my background is materials, and so I always go back into asbestos, a very good material. We found a very good insulation materials. We used it widely and far and wide, from aircraft to houses to anything you can think of insulation. Because you need to insulate, but many years later we learned it's a very bad thing to have, and so now we close the street if you have a house with an asbestos in it. So is that kind of thinking around it? We need to probably think not just what we need now. We need to think about what do we need in 2050, what do we need in 2070, because in the future the system we create now will have implications how the future goes. And so I think the policies need to widen up a little bit, look at the wide long-term perspective, not just today.
I would agree with you on that one. If anybody has any more questions, if you'd like to leave them in the chat. Yeah, we just had another question come through from, I'm not going to be able to say this properly, Pathrivian. It says, hi James, thank you. When we say hydrogen embrittlement, are you referring to high temperature hydrogen attack? Just from my understanding, hydrogen when transported through a pipeline, it will be in atom or molecular form.
I think at the current status, there's different way of transporting hydrogen, because we've been transporting small little scales, which we control and manage very well. But I think the future, we'll be probably having to use more diverse materials than we're using today. The enrichment at high temperature is obviously a key issue, but what you need to think about is the long-term duration of material, because everything degrades, everything decays, and so although you have high temperature degradation, you got a low temperature degradation, we have contamination in those pipes, we have leakage on those pipes, there will be material themselves making the pipes are not perfect, and so there will be implication on that. So we need to think the form we use for transporting the gas probably could be easier, because the gas is probably the gas have much more higher density in the end of hydrogen than gas in terms of long term. If you're going to go with gas, then we need to think about the leakage around the pipe. So you've got a valve, you're not just affecting the embrittlement around the pipe itself, but you're also thinking about the embrittlement around the valve systems that work with it. So is it going to be molecular form or going to be atomic form? I think it could be either, but most likely to be molecular form.
Brilliant. I think we might have time for one more question if anybody else would like to ask anything. I would just like to remind you all again that this is the penultimate webinar in our webinar series this round. The next one will be in November, and it will be from Leon with a law perspective. So we have another question. Oh, just about the recordings. Yes, so all the recordings for all the webinars, all the previous webinars are all on the National Subsea Centre YouTube page. I can find a link and put it in the chat. But if nobody has any more questions, I can end the session here. As I said, all the information about the next episodes can be found on Eventbrite, and all of our previous webinar series will be on the National Subsea Centre YouTube channel. Thank you very much, James, for taking part in this webinar series today. It's been great to have you presenting instead of hosting. And then thank you again to all the researchers involved.
Thanks very much too. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.